Man has always been fascinated by the stars. The haunting question of what's out there drove men to the extremes of exploration. In July of 1958, NASA was established, the first American organization built with the purpose of space exploration, including the search for extraterrestrial life. On July 20th, 1969, after NASA was first established, America succeeded in putting the first man on the moon. Today, the search continues for life beyond our own planet. But perhaps there is a life form here on Earth that more humans should be concerned with. This organism has been among us since the beginning of time, and recently it has come to the attention of scientists as a serious threat to human life. Bacteria are everywhere. There are over 300 kinds of bacteria that exist in the human mouth alone. According to Dr. Brett Finlay, a Howard Hughes Medical Institute international research scholar, bacteria are everywhere, and they are very numerous. Within our body, there are 10 times more bacteria than the number of human cells. They exist in our hair, on our skin, and in our homes. So what exactly are they? Bacteria are single-celled, microscopic organisms that reproduce through a process of cell division known as binary fission. They can be both beneficial and harmful to us. Recently, however, bacteria have become stigmatized as the bad guys of the healthcare industry. Outbreaks of antibiotic-resistant bacteria have caused quite the uproar and have placed many lives in danger. Antibiotics were an astonishing addition to modern medicine, and an accidental one at that. In 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered that a mold growing in a sample dish killed off several bacterial colonies. This mold became known as penicillin, the first ever antibiotic. Since then, many new antibiotics have been invented and put into use in today's medical fields. Many of them are specifically designed to treat particular bacterial infections in wounds or illnesses caused by bacteria. However, these antibiotics are no longer working with the same potency as they did 20 years ago. Bacteria are getting stronger and more resistant to the antibiotics designed to defeat them. But how? Well, to answer that question, we need to go back a little and look at some of the history behind bacteria. In a 1943 study funded by grants from the Danzian Foundation for Medical Research and from the Rockefeller Foundation, 2 professors from Indiana University and Vanderbilt University set out to determine how bacteria were able to adapt to harsh environments. They realized that when bacteria were introduced to a toxin, such as an antibiotic, while large numbers of the bacteria were wiped out, there were almost always a few who survived. They decided to look at a series of 5 to 100 cultures of bacteria that were introduced to a toxin. After 24 and 48 hours, they would count the number of colonies still present. This method allowed them to look at small and large samples of bacteria multiple times to eliminate false results. When they checked the cultures, Luria and Delbruck would look to see whether the surviving bacteria were in isolated groupings or in a random distribution. This would allow them to see if the bacteria adapted to their settings or if they were mutant strains of bacteria that were surviving the toxins. The study showed that the bacteria were surviving in clonal groups, small clusters that had formed after all the other, weaker bacteria had been killed off by the toxin. This proved that the surviving bacteria left after 24 or 48 hours stemmed from mutant bacteria that had survived the toxin replicating over time. There are many antibiotics in the world right now that are specifically designed to combat dangerous bacteria. However, bacteria are becoming resistant to it because of their ability to adapt and multiply quickly. So how does this affect us? We now know because of Luria and Delbruck's study that bacteria can mutate and resist toxins and antibiotics, as well as produce other bacteria that are equally resistant to those same toxins. The ability of bacteria to produce other cells with the ability to resist antibiotics means that bacteria have DNA. DNA are small strands of protein that contain specific genetic codes that make each bacterial cell unique. So let's break this down a little. DNA are known as the building blocks of life. We as humans possess DNA which we pass on to our children, 1 strand from the mother and 1 strand from the father. Bacteria replicate in a slightly different way through a process known as binary fission. In binary fission, a single organism, in this case a single bacterial cell, creates enough DNA to be shared between 2 cells. Allow me to illustrate. Let's begin with 1 bacterial cell. When a cell is mature enough to pass on its DNA material, it begins the first process of binary fission, called DNA replication. Bacteria have a nucleoid, a structure of the cell that contains DNA and protein, the building blocks for life. Inside the nucleoid, the cell makes many identical copies of the cell's DNA during a process called DNA replication. Once the strands of DNA have developed, they migrate to opposite sides of the nucleoid. Once both sides of the cell have roughly the same amount of DNA, the cell splits, creating two new cells called daughter cells, which contain exactly the same amount of DNA obtained from the original cell. Because some bacteria are resistant to antibiotics, modern antibiotics are quickly becoming outdated. Bacteria that contain DNA resistant to antibiotics can pass on their DNA to other cells through the process of binary fission. Because these bacteria can replicate so quickly, it is becoming difficult for scientists to develop new antibiotics that can fight off the new resistant strains. As modern science struggles to keep up with the rapid growth of these amazing life forms, exploration of space continues at an almost astonishing rate. Who knows, maybe somewhere out in the cosmos lies the answer to our struggles with bacteria and antibiotic resistance. Perhaps a new alien organism will shed some light on the unknowns here on our own planet.